Well, over the last few weeks, as you know, I've been out in Dover in the English Straits. I've been down on the beaches in East Sussex identifying this illegal migrant wave that is coming into the United Kingdom and is now reaching a pace the likes of which we've not seen before. Over 1,300 people have come in since lockdown began to the country. Not a single one, to my knowledge, has been returned, and we're now being put in hotels all over the Midlands and the North. And Australia faced a very similar problem to this just over a decade ago. And I thought it's one thing to identify a problem, but it's even more important to try and find solutions. So I'm really pleased to be joined by Tony Abbott, former Australian Prime Minister. Tony, thank you and welcome.
Nigel, it's lovely to be with you. Look, we've had two waves of illegal arrivals by sea in Australia. The first took place in the late 1990s when John Howard was Prime Minister. The second took place when Kevin Rudd and Julia Gillard were Prime Ministers. John Howard ended the first wave essentially by stopping the Tampa, which was carrying some 400 would-be illegal migrants by boat. He sent them to Nauru as part of the offshore solution, and that essentially fixed the problem. Unfortunately, the measures that John Howard put in place were reversed by the Labor government after 2008, and we started to get this problem again. And within a few years, a trickle became a flood. Back in July of 2013, we had almost 5,000 illegal arrivals by boat in a single month. That's a rate of over 50,000 a year. And plainly, it was becoming effectively a form of peaceful invasion. I won the election in September 2013, and I did two things. First of all, I re-established our era policies of temporary protection visas, offshore processing, and boat turnarounds. But we did a couple of other things as well. We put in a unified chain of command through Operation Sovereign Borders, which meant that the Coast Guard, the Navy, and immigration were all working under the one system. We had a news blackout because every time an illegal boat arrived, and an announcement was made, it was effectively shipping news for people smugglers. The third thing, and perhaps the most important thing we did, was that where the people smugglers scuttled their boats, forcing the Australian Navy to pick up the would-be illegal migrants and effectively bring them to our country, we provided big orange lifeboats, which we then towed to within 12 miles of Indonesia from whence all these boats had come, with just enough fuel to get back to Indonesia, and said, off you go. Now, all of my expert officials told me that the Indonesians wouldn't like it, and I accepted that the Indonesians wouldn't like it. But given that we only had the problem because Indonesia had effectively waved these people onto Australia, Indonesia was not nearly as efficient and effective at cracking down on people smuggling as it should be. I thought it was fair enough to send these people back from whence they'd come, because let's face it, there was no problem of safety in Indonesia, but it wasn't the life they wanted. They didn't want safety in a country like Indonesia. They wanted the good life in a country like Australia. Now, who can blame them? But it's not Australia's duty to say to everyone, well, if you can get here, you can stay here, because if you do that, effectively, you're opening the door potentially to millions of people, and no self-respecting country can endure that.
I can imagine. I mean, there must have been howls of outrage from the Liberal left and the mainstream media in Sydney about what you were doing.
There certainly were. John Howard had copped massive criticism in his time for policies to turn boats around. I copped massive criticism even in opposition. Indeed, the then Prime Minister, Kevin Rudd, said that the coalition's policies would bring about war with Indonesia. The language was that over the top.
Wow.
And there is no doubt, as I said, that the Indonesians didn't like it. And when we started doing it, it did cast a chill on our relations for some time. But look, the Indonesians are pragmatic. They respect strength. They realised that people smuggling for them was a fourth-order issue, but it was a first-order issue for us, and therefore we had to take the measures that we did.
And how did you get the message to potential migrants who, of course, would have fallen into the arms of the criminal gang saying, come with us, pay us a few $1,000s and we'll get you there? How did that message get out?
It's a good question, Nigel. I can remember one day, I think it was late in December 2013, the front page of the Daily Telegraph in Sydney, which is our biggest selling tabloid newspaper, was dominated by a huge photograph of one of our orange life rafts washed up on a beach in Indonesia. And I thought, that is the most powerful message, because that will circulate like wildfire in the circles that are constantly being explored by would-be illegal migrants. And the truth is that after January of 2013, we had no boats for something like 3 years. And what we've seen since then is a handful, if that, of people seeking to make the very dangerous journey from Indonesia to Australia by leaky boat.
Now, as you know, the English Channel is just 20 miles wide, and they're coming over on sort of small inflatables, 14, 16, 18 foot long, something like that. Some with a dozen on. One that I discovered with 22 on. I mean, I couldn't believe it was even floating. And, you know, what we are seeing, and I've witnessed this, Tony. I've filmed it. I've exposed it.
Yeah.
We're seeing the French Navy. We've given the French 61 million quid, right, to help stop this problem from happening. And that is with, you know, security, fencing, equipment, all the rest of it. And what we've seen is the French Navy say that if they try, and I guess there's a parallel here with Indonesia, the French Navy say that if they try to turn a boat around to get the people on board and take them back into Calais or Boulogne or wherever it may be, that the migrants don't want to go back to France, and they resist. And for that reason, the French are effectively escorting them over the line in the English Channel, and Border Force, it seems, then are happy to pick these people up. I mean, how do you, as somebody who, you know, and I know you've spent quite a lot of time in this country and you're pretty pro the United Kingdom. I mean, how do you view our situation right now? Look,
we had a similar situation, in some respects at least, back in the Rudd Gillard era. The Australian Navy was patrolling the seas between Java and Christmas Island. We were routinely coming across people smuggling boats. Inevitably, these boats were unseaworthy. Our Navy picked up the passengers and took them to Christmas Island, which was exactly what they wanted. So it wasn't a coast guard so much as a coast guide. And our Navy was effectively acting almost as an agent for the people smugglers.
Like a taxi.
Now, it just a water taxi service for people smugglers. Now, the Navy didn't like it. They hated it because they could see what was going on here. They could see that the people smugglers were effectively having a lend of us. But the bleeding hearts that were then in charge of the Australian government said, well, what option have we got? Well, if you keep giving the people smugglers a product to sell, you will keep getting people smuggling. And if you have people smuggling, inevitably you'll have deaths at sea. And the estimate is that something between 2 and 3% of those who set out, over 1,000 people in this case, died at sea in that period between when I stopped the boats and after Kevin Rudd and others had started them up again. So, look, you've got to be firm to be fair. You've got to be tough to be kind in the end. And the kindest thing you can do is close down the people smuggling trade. And that means as soon as you come across a people smuggling boat, stopping it and taking it back to the place from which it came. And sure, the Indonesians didn't much like it, but by stopping the trade, we've prevented what was happening, which was tens of thousands of people flying into Jakarta, mostly from Muslim countries where the Indonesians didn't require visas. These people would then hang around in Jakarta. Many of them would become a nuisance, resort to petty crime. They'd make their way to the south coast of Java, again, hang around, a nuisance, before finally getting on a boat to Australia. And many of them, as we know, died in the attempt. So in the long run, it's much better for the French and for France if these boats don't take off, or if they do take off, that they're stopped midway across the channel and the people brought back to France. Otherwise, France is going to have a problem and Britain is going to have a problem. But it does require a rather hard-headed approach which addresses this problem at its core. You can understand why people from rotten countries would want to get to wonderful countries. And frankly, you can understand why Calais would just be a way station for these people, just as Jakarta was a way station. Who wouldn't want to get to the United Kingdom? Such a wonderful, free and fair and prosperous country. But as long as the French facilitate their passage, France will have a problem as well as Britain will have a problem. But if it takes a bit of toughness on Britain's part, Bojo has his mojo, let's face it, let's send them back.
Right, good, Tony, that's back. Absolutely
what could
clear.
Be fairer than that?
No, it's clear.
What could be fairer than that?
I think the parallels are remarkable. And can I finish? I must ask you, because a lot of attention is focusing on your time zone, and in particular with what's happened in Hong Kong. Now, I know that back in 1973, when we joined the common market, it was considered by many Australians to be a bit of a stab in the back. And it made it very difficult for many of your agricultural produce, wine, etc., to be sold in the UK without really punitive tariffs. And I know that Australia kind of quite sensibly pivoted away towards Australia, and you have a very high level of economic interdependence with China, and yet Huawei is not going to be part of your 5G system. But when you see Hong Kong, what do you think the global response to China now needs to be?
Okay, well, look, a couple of points. I hope that we can very swiftly do a free trade deal with a post-Brexit Britain. And frankly, it ought to be a one-page free trade deal which says that goods shall be absolutely free of tariffs and quotas, and there will be mutual recognition of qualifications and standards. And frankly, if you're a law firm in London, you ought to be able to hang up your shingle in Sydney and vice versa. If you're a doctor in Sydney, you ought to be able to practice in London and vice versa. And as far as Britain and Australia are concerned, there should be free movement of people for work, not welfare, certainly subject to a generous quota. My parents' generation, indeed my generation, it was almost a rite of passage for Australians to go and live and work for a significant period of time in Britain. And I know a lot of Britons have spent a significant period of time in Australia. A lot of great Britons were born in Australia, and a lot of great Australians were born in Britain, and long may that continue to be the case. So look, Huawei, we took the view, and this has been a bipartisan position here in Australia, that Huawei is, in essence, subject to direction by the Chinese Communist government. In fact, at Chinese law, all businesses are required to obey all the dictates of the Chinese Communist government, and the Chinese Communist government is vastly more risk at doing what it wants than any Western democratic government is. And why would you allow into the heart of your sensitive telecommunications infrastructure an entity which is effectively an agent for the Chinese Communist government, which it's more and more clear is no longer a good international citizen, but a pretty threatening international bully. So I hope that the reconsideration of Huawei's participation in Britain's 5G network can go ahead. Now, to finish with Hong Kong, look, I've got nothing but admiration for the people of Hong Kong. It's wonderful to see the Union Jack being flown on the streets of Hong Kong by protesters who remember the priceless legacy they got from Britain. Market freedoms, the rule of law, and a degree of political pluralism. Obviously, the Chinese Communist government finds all of this poison, and they are doing their damnedest to stop it from spreading. In the end, not only would this be a tragedy for the people of Hong Kong, it would be a bitter tragedy for the whole world, because as things stand, along with London, New York and Singapore, Hong Kong is one of the great international cities. And it will be sad for China because one of the reasons why China has been so economically successful in recent decades is the proximity of Hong Kong and the exposure to the kind of sophisticated market mechanisms that up till now Hong Kong has been so expert at.
Tony, thank you very much on both those big stories for joining us. I know there's a UK audience going to be really keen to hear that parallel with what happened in Australia. We've got to find solutions, not just identify problems.
And Nigel, if I may finish on this note, if the Chinese do crush Hong Kong, it can't be something which is just thought of as of no great consequence. There will need to be serious sanctions put on the Chinese leadership, at least as serious as the sanctions that were placed on Russia when Russia illegally annexed the Crimea and then fomented a proxy civil war in the Western Ukraine.
Yeah, no, I'm afraid it's a new Cold War. I think that we're going into. Tony, thanks ever so much indeed for joining us.